Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Frazier, and I'm a scientist at the Exploratorium. Thank you for joining me today for COVID Conversations, our new series where your questions guide our interviews of leading scientists and doctors. Today, I'm honored to have our first guest, Dr. Margaret Hamburg. Dr. Hamburg currently serves as the Foreign Secretary for the National Academy of Medicine. This is just the most recent post in an illustrious career in public health, which includes serving as the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration for 6 years under former President Barack Obama. She's not only devoted her life to public health, she's also been a strong advocate for the role of science in society, serving as the president for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is where I had the honor of meeting Dr. Hamburg. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hamburg for our first COVID conversation.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And, you know, I think we're just going to like jump right into some of the things people want to know most about. And I think
Terrific.
we're going to start with testing. So
Okay.
I think any plan that we've been hearing about, whether it's from our mayor, governors, the president, we keep hearing about how for us to kind of go back to life as normal, we are going to have frequent and accurate testing. But there's, a lot of news and still not a lot of tests. Where are we today?
Well, testing has been slow from the beginning in this country, unfortunately, and we're just really beginning to see the number of tests and the ability to do tests that we're going to need, but we have to keep ramping up. Tests are important for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it enables us to identify who, in fact, is infected with this novel coronavirus, who needs care, and also who needs to be isolated so that they don't spread that infection to other people. In addition, testing allows us as a public health tool to actually do surveys in communities to better understand where the virus may be lurking, but not yet really have declared itself in terms of potential new hotspots or areas of spread. So, being able to test is really fundamental to our understanding of where we are in this outbreak and fundamental to our understanding of how to manage individual uh, patients and their potentially exposed contacts.
All right. So, I mean, that's one thing that, like, even for me trying to keep up with this as a scientist, it's like, okay, testing, right? And then I see, oh, this and that CRISPR test, this PCR test, this, serology test. Can you
Mhm.
kind of just give us a general breakdown of like the categories of tests and which are sort of the most urgent right now?
Sure. Well, there are two main categories of tests that you hear talked about. One is to actually measure the presence of the virus to tell you if someone is infected, someone has active disease. The other, the antibody test or serology test, uh, gives you a measure of the body's immune response, the development of antibodies to having been infected. So you do the antigen test, the test for the virus, when you're trying to figure out who is infected, who has COVID 19 disease. But if you want to know whether someone was exposed, was infected, even if they never had symptoms, then you look at the antibody test. And it's important that both of these tests be available as we try to really understand where we are and where we've been in terms of patterns of infection and how to manage both individuals and populations and communities. It's also really important that we make sure that those tests work. And you've probably been hearing concerns that some of those tests aren't as reliable as they should be. And that really matters because if you think you're testing for something, if you think that you've just been told that you don't have COVID 19 and in fact you are infected because the test is wrong, then you may make bad decisions and other additional decisions may be made subsequently on that bad information. So we have work to do on the testing front, but it's something that is very, very crucial. And as we start to loosen restrictions, There's going to be more emphasis on making sure that we have tests, that we're testing the right people, and that we're following up on those tests, because that's the way we're going to interrupt ongoing transmission of this virus.
Well, and so it sounds like, when if we have limited time and we're kind of paying attention to the news, that some of these diagnostic tests, like ones that might involve
Mhm.
CRISPR or PCR, actually figuring out whether someone is
Right.
actively infected is probably the most critical for like where we are in this moment, while the other might help us understand sort of the immunity and
That's
herd
right.
immunity and things later.
No, that's exactly right. And I think you also have sort of touched on the fact that we also need to continue to innovate with respect to diagnostic tests. That the first tests were very traditional kinds of diagnostic tests using something called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. Um, and the first set of tests took time. Uh, and unfortunately, because of the system being overwhelmed early on, there were huge delays in the test results coming back in some instances. So you'd have to wait several days. Sometimes reports were that the delays were even longer. And that's very hard if decisions have to be made on the basis of, is this person infected or not? So there's been a push for more rapid diagnostic tests, and that can be done. And there's some of those available now. The next big push is really to try to have diagnostic tests that can be done at home, almost like a pregnancy test, so that you can quickly know and assess your status. And we probably realistically want to be using a range of different kind of tests for different conditions and circumstances. But what is really important, and I think we're finally getting to where we need to be, is that we are really harnessing all of the advances in science and technology today to give us these diagnostic tools that we need, just as we're trying to also develop drugs to treat and manage COVID-19 disease, and also, of course, the search for a vaccine.
Well, and that, I mean, just on the testing front, again, we're definitely going to get to vaccines because I think there's a lot of interest in that for sure. I think one of the reasons, with this diagnostic testing seems so important, and especially quick testing, as you've discussed,
Mhm.
is that, COVID-19, one of the things we've learned over the last few months is that people can be infected without having any symptoms. And so many of us that want to be good citizens, we're used to thinking, oh, I have a fever, I have a cough, I better stay home from work. Oh, darn, my child has, tummy troubles. I better keep them home from daycare. But one of the real challenges, it seems like with COVID-19, is that people can either have no symptoms or be infectious before they're
Right.
showing symptoms, which seems like that's why we really need testing. So, can you kind of tell us a little bit about what we know now about the symptom-free,
Yeah.
transition?
Well, it's good news and bad news. The good news with this disease is that most people who get infected with this novel coronavirus actually have mild to moderate disease, and many actually are asymptomatic. It's a relatively small percentage that go on to severe disease requiring hospitalization, and of course death in some instances. But what has been a surprise is that there really is a group of patients who feel perfectly well, really are asymptomatic, and yet we have discovered that they can spread the disease. Or they may be asymptomatic for a period, but spreading, and then they may start to develop symptoms. So we do need to think about this disease and its management a little bit differently than with many of the other viruses that we're more familiar with, including flu, where you're generally, most communicable in terms of the infectiousness of the disease when you have symptoms. And this has really led to some changes in recommendations. The notion of wearing masks when you go outside, when you come into contact with people, that isn't to keep you from getting infected. In fact, that's to keep you, if you are asymptomatic but infected, from spreading it to others. So I think that this is one of the challenges. And of course, we also know that children seem to be less likely to get severe disease, although they are not immune to getting serious disease. And we're learning more about some of the complications of this disease in children that's very worrisome. But children generally are more likely to be asymptomatic. But what does that mean in terms of their ability to spread the disease, both amongst each other in a school setting or to teachers and others in the school setting or the congregate setting, and also to bring it back into their homes, especially if there are older people or people with other medical problems who might be especially vulnerable. So we really need to move quickly from a scientific point of view to sort out some of these still open questions as we are starting to think about relaxing some of the restrictions and returning to some aspects of life as we knew it before COVID-19.
Well, and I think that really the reason I even brought up the asymptomatic transmission in this focus on testing is, I think one of the questions a lot of our audience have, and, I even have is, okay, we've got a lot of people potentially walking around who are carrying the disease but don't know it. Our children might be going to school, we might be going to work, we might be infected. How often do we need to test to feel safe, right? Safe sending our children to school or being children going to school, safe going back to work, to church, to a birthday party. Like, how often do you really think we need to be being tested so that we feel like we can go about any sort of semblance of normal life?
That, of course, is such a great question, but it's also very hard to
Yeah.
answer. There's a lot that we still don't know. And, there unfortunately is no really risk free context as long as this virus is circulating in the community. Um, you can be tested, but a negative test doesn't mean that you will be negative even a few hours later if you come into contact with an individual who is infected and have sufficient contact that there is transmission. It might be a little while after that that your test would in fact be positive if you were retested, but we don't want people to think that getting tested once is the answer, and if you're negative that means you can go about life just as you were before. I think it is an important element, though, of really getting a better sense of where the virus is, who's infected, who might they have exposed, so that we can really track and control the virus and its spread. You've probably heard people talk about contact tracing.
Yeah.
Well, testing really needs to be coupled to contact tracing because you want to be able to test someone if they're infected, make sure that they remain isolated while they're experiencing the infection so that they don't spread it to other people, but they may have already spread it to other people. So you want to be able to identify who did they come in contact with, ask those people to not go out and gather with others and monitor their symptoms, and you want to test them to see if they've been infected as well. So it's a whole dynamic process. And different settings require probably different levels of intense testing scrutiny as we think about returning to workplaces and other settings, both in terms of just the realities of we don't have hundreds of millions of tests to test every American every day.
Yeah.
I don't think that many people would tolerate being tested every day either, at least until we have some tests widely available that don't require jamming a cotton swab way up your nose. And certainly kids in school, you're not going to be able to test them every day. But I think having some baseline knowledge as you go into the workplace, and then making sure you have systems for monitoring, like temperature and symptom reporting, and then marrying that with the system of contact tracing for when people do have symptoms, when people are tested, then um, doing the deeper dive into the analysis with testing. And then, we really need to think about what the workplace or the school setting is going to look like. And it's not going to be where we were, back in September when the school year started, or for those of us of work age, where we were before the the winter holidays and the start of the new year. We're going to have workplaces where there's more social distancing, where there are going to be split shifts so that there's not such a great density. People will be wearing masks,
Yeah.
and people will be doing their work in different ways. And I think a lot of people that can telecommute to work will continue to telecommute to work. So it's going to be different, the so-called new normal.
Yeah, no, and I think that, something I think that's really been on people's minds, over the last few weeks as we hear and learn more about how much testing or maybe little hints about contact tracing or shift work.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think for a lot of us, then what that leads us to is when will there be a vaccine? So I think that's something definitely people are so hopeful for. And someone like you especially that really was involved in the HIV crisis and was the commissioner at the FDA for so long. You have a lot of experience seeing, what has worked or not worked for vaccines. What do you really think the prospects are for a vaccine for, the virus that causes COVID-19?
Yes, well, vaccines really are ultimately going to be what's going to afford all of us protection against infection and really enable us to move to the next stage as we, struggle to overcome COVID-19 and all of its many repercussions, and the social and economic disruptions that have been caused by this terrible disease, as well as, of course, the burden on health and disease. So there's been a huge effort to try to really mobilize the science and the scientific community to try to develop a new vaccine. And it's really been unlike anything I've ever seen in my professional career. And you're seeing academic scientists working with industry scientists, working with government, and you're seeing people working across borders as well in important international collaborations. And right now there's an extraordinary number of potential vaccine candidates under development. Some 100 plus.
Oh, wow.
Clearly, not all of those are ever going to even get out of the lab, but it gives you hope that we've got a strong bench, so to speak. There are now, I think, 8 vaccines that are actually in human study, and this has
Oh,
been a record.
wow.
The You have to sort of step back and realize that it was only in early January when this virus was identified and the genome for the virus was posted by the Chinese. And after that, there was rapid progress in a number of scientific domains. But one certainly has been in vaccines. And the first vaccine to go into human study was only about 9 weeks after the
Oh,
posting of the genome. So that's extraordinary. That is a world record in vaccine development, and it reflects the kind of urgency that's going on. It also reflects, for that particular vaccine, that there'd been earlier investments in trying to start to make a vaccine against another coronavirus, a virus that's different than this SARS coronavirus 2 that we're dealing with, but enough related that it was a good foundation to move rapidly. Now with vaccines, you have to really undertake the research and development very carefully, because you're giving vaccines to people that are healthy in order to protect them from getting a disease.
yeah.
So it has to work. We want it to protect them, but it also has to be safe, because you don't want to make a healthy person worse. You
And
don't
that's,
want to cause problems.
yeah.
So vaccines historically have been developed in a very careful, stepwise way, and you evaluate your data at each step of the way. And vaccines for developers come with a lot of risk, both there's no certainty that the science will unfold the way you want and the vaccine will really work and be safe. But there's also financial risks because it takes a lot of time and money to develop vaccines, and so you do it in a stepwise way. Now, because of the importance of finding a vaccine and the real sense of urgency in this country around the world, people are trying to be as innovative as possible, to streamline the process as much as possible, sort of collapsing some of the standard steps, uh, enough to speed the process, but not too much to result in problems in terms of not recognizing important safety signals. And we absolutely need to take the time to make sure that the vaccines work. So there have been some suggestions that we might have a vaccine as early as the end of this year. I
Well,
think those might be optimistic.
oh, darn.
I think, we all, cross our fingers, cross our toes that we should be so lucky, but that would break all records in terms of the speed of vaccine development. And, much as we all want a vaccine, I think we'll have some treatments uh, that will help us to manage the disease while we're waiting for the vaccine. But I think the vaccine may take longer. And of course, there have been some medical conditions, including HIV, where even though there's been intense effort, the best scientists working on the problem, lots of money put into research and development, we still don't have an effective HIV vaccine because the scientific problems are huge.
But this is, you addressed a lot of the questions without even hearing them. You anticipated a lot of our audience's questions, which, can we really accelerate a vaccine? Which it sounds like there is, a good chance. And I think there is a lot of public concern. On the one hand, we're all like, yes, let's get that vaccine so that we can, not have to test every day. I mean, I think some of us imagine like, let's test before soccer practice, let's test between each patient. I think the idea is obviously we all want a well, not all of us, a lot of us really, really long for a vaccine. I think, the issue that I appreciate you acknowledging the safety, because I think that is something where a lot of our audience had questions about how do we ensure that a vaccine is safe. And so, I think you addressed some of that, but do you think there are like important things to be looking for when we start reading news about, oh, this vaccine's coming online? You know, what are things we can think about when we consider the safety of a vaccine?
Yeah. Well, one thing I have to say might not surprise you since I did spend 6 years as the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, but it's very, very important that the regulatory authority, like here in the US, the Food and Drug Administration, is part of the process from early on, really helping the research community and the industry developers to understand what are the critical questions that have to be asked and answered as we examine whether this vaccine candidate in fact will meet standards of scientific rigor, for demonstrated safety and efficacy. Nothing is without risk and nothing is perfectly protective, but we need to know the parameters. We need to be able to assess and weigh and balance the risks and the benefits. And that does take some time and it takes doing the studies to get the answers. But it is so critically important, and it's part of the sort of bread and butter of what regulatory authorities um, do and are good at. But it's also something that companies care about because they don't want to have problems.
No.
The ability to be able to really use vaccines effectively, and we've seen what a difference they have made in eliminating childhood preventable diseases in areas that used to take kids' lives or cause lifelong disease and disability. And we've
So,
certainly seen the difference they can make, not only in this country, but addressing medical and disease issues around the world. But we also know that the public has to have trust and confidence in those vaccines, and that they have to really know that someone is looking out for them and
Yes.
making sure that they will be protected from any inadvertent damage. So it's a complicated process. That's part of why I think we shouldn't be overly optimistic telling the public when these vaccines may be available, because people really are desperately looking to the hope that a vaccine can
Mhm.
bring, but they don't want us to do it too quickly if it means cutting corners and actually not doing all that needs to be done to demonstrate safety and efficacy.
Well, I mean, I appreciate you saying that because I think that's the thing we have to balance, everyone is so hopeful and wants to like sort of alleviate so much of the suffering that's being caused. But I think it's important for us to balance that with what you're saying, which is we want to make sure this is safe. We want to make sure if there's a vaccine that, you know, our regulatory experts and agencies really have had the opportunity to follow the process they need to follow. And that's why I know you are involved and advise a lot of them. And I could sit here and talk to you all day, but I'm also trying to make these short enough that, our general audiences can
Right.
digest these, and so maybe I'll just keep talking to you later. Just kidding.
Okay.
No, but
That
I
would
know,
be
I really
terrific.
everyone, I am so deeply appreciative to Dr. Hamburg for spending the time with us today, given, the number of roles that she has and all of the, like, committees and things she's serving on, because I think this perspective, high level perspective on some of the most critical things is so helpful to me and hopefully to all of you. And I guess, in closing, I think all of us, it's easy with someone like you to just be thinking, oh, she knows all the science, she's a doctor. And I appreciate your time so much. But I think, you know, you're still a human being, right? Who has children, you've got the nice pictures on your
Right,
portability
right.
bookshelf, you've got family. And, how are you getting through this challenging time just as a person? What's keeping you sort of going through all of this?
Well, it is tough. And, one of the things that, for me has been discouraging is that for literally decades now, I've been working on pandemic threat issues. How can we prevent pandemics? How can we better prepare to address them as well as possible? I thought, number one, that we'd made more progress, and I think that unfortunately our response hasn't been as effective and coordinated and aggressive as I would have liked. Um, but I would say that the other side of that is that it's been extraordinary to me to see the engagement of the public,
Mhm.
how quickly the public has learned so many important aspects of what this um, unfolding disease outbreak is about. They've learned about the virus and what it looks like and how it causes disease. They've learned about the human immune response and antibodies. They've learned about public health and testing and contact tracing. Um, and also, they've learned to actually do things differently in their own lives to protect their own health and the health of their families, but also to protect the health of their communities.
Yeah.
And that's been extraordinary to watch. And people have done things that I never would have imagined in terms of social distancing
Mhm.
and
Ugh.
adopting practices that are so restrictive in so many ways. And I think, that this next period is going to be challenging, but I think, that we have a renewed sense of appreciation, even though we've been social
Mhm.
distancing,
Yeah.
about the importance of social engagement
Yes.
and commitment to community and society in the world we live
Mhm.
in. And so I think we're going to get through this. And
Yes.
maybe we're going to get through it with a set of new values and a bit of a renewed commitment to the importance of science in all our lives as well.
Oh, I love thinking that's, yes, it's definitely a hard time, but I love thinking of that, like seeing these, how much we value our communities, how much we're all willing to do to protect our communities. And also, the science good news, right? Applauding our scientists and people
Right.
like you for working so tirelessly. So thank you for everything that you're doing and for taking the time today, to help our public learn more about the science because there is a lot, and having you sort of distill it was so helpful. And I just hope you continue to be well, and thank you so much for everything that you've done.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the exploratorium. Our family visited when the kids were young, and we still talk about it today. So,
Oh, all the way from the East Coast.
that's right.
Oh,
That's right.
thank you so much, Dr. Hamburg. I really appreciate it, and we'll hopefully see you in person soon.
I hope so too.
Okay,
Wonderful. Thanks.
bye.